The forest has always been a place of peace for me. Since childhood, I have loved to walk among the trees, listen to the birds singing and inhale the scent of pine needles. But everything changed last fall. Then I decided to go hiking alone to take a break from the hustle and bustle of the city. I chose a remote forest area that I had heard about from friends. They said there were no tourists there, just wildlife and silence. That's exactly what I needed. I arrived at the place in the late afternoon. The forest greeted me with a thick fog that crept between the trees like a living being. The air was humid and cold, and the silence was so thick that I could hear my every step. I set up camp in a small clearing, pitched a tent, and lit a campfire. Everything seemed perfect. But at night, everything changed. I woke up to the sound. It was a thud, like someone hitting wood. I lay in the tent, listening. The knock came again, closer this time. I looked out, but there was only fog and darkness. The bonfire had almost gone out, only weak embers smoldered in the fire pit. I decided that it was probably an animal, and tried to go back to sleep. But after a few minutes, I heard a voice. He was quiet, almost a whisper, but I could make out the words, "You shouldn't have come here." I froze. The voice sounded so close, as if someone was standing right outside the tent. I grabbed a flashlight and went outside. The light was shining through the fog, but I couldn't see anyone. Only the trees that stood like silent sentinels. I went back to the tent, but I couldn't sleep. The voice repeated itself several more times, each time closer and more insistent. In the morning, I decided to leave. But when I packed my things and went to the car, I realized that I was lost. The forest that I knew like the back of my hand suddenly became a stranger. The trees were so close together that I couldn't tell which was north and which was south. I walked for several hours, but kept returning to the same clearing where I had set up camp. And then I saw her. There was an inscription carved on the tree directly above my tent. "You're not leaving." I was standing in front of the tree on which that ominous inscription was carved. My hands were shaking, and all I could think was, who did this? And why? I looked around. The forest was quiet, only the wind rustled the leaves, but this silence seemed unnatural. It was as if someone was watching me from behind the trees. I decided not to stay in the clearing. I took my backpack and a flashlight and went deeper into the forest, hoping to find my way to the car. But the deeper I got, the stronger the feeling became that I wasn't alone. Sometimes it seemed to me that someone was following me. I turned around, but I didn't see anyone. Only the trees that stood so close to each other that they seemed like a wall. A few hours later, I came across an old hut. It was dilapidated, with rotten walls and a sunken roof. I got closer and saw that the door was slightly ajar. It was dark inside, but I noticed that there were some things lying on the floor. Empty food cans, scraps of clothes, rusty tools. Someone lived here. And, apparently, recently. I wanted to leave, but then I heard a sound. It was a faint moan, as if someone was in pain. I froze. The sound was repeated, louder this time. He was coming from the depths of the hut. I picked up a stick to defend myself and went inside. There was a man lying in the corner of the room. He was thin, almost skeletal, with a dirty beard and tousled hair. His eyes were closed, but he was breathing. I got closer and saw that his leg was injured. The wound looked fresh, and there were traces of blood around it. "Who are you?" I asked, but the man didn't answer. He just moaned again. I bent down to examine the wound, and then he grabbed my arm. His eyes opened, and I saw panic in them. "Go away," he whispered. "He's here." "Who's there?" I asked, but the man had already lost consciousness. I felt a chill run down my spine. Someone was in the woods. Someone who didn't want me to leave. I decided to help this man, but for that I had to find water and something for bandaging. I left the hut and went to the nearest stream that I had heard before. But when I returned, the hut was empty. The man disappeared. There were only traces of blood on the floor that led to the door. I went outside and saw that the tracks continued into the forest. They were fresh, as if someone was dragging him along. I followed the tracks. They led deep into the forest, to where the trees stood so close to each other that they barely let in any light. A few minutes later, I came across a clearing. In the center of it was a table on which lay tools, knives, ropes, an axe. And next to him was the man I saw in the hut. He was tied to a tree, his eyes were closed, but he was breathing. I wanted to go over, but then I heard footsteps. They were slow, heavy, as if someone was walking on gravel. I turned around and saw him. It was a man. Tall, with broad shoulders and a face hidden under a hood. He was holding an axe in his hands. He stopped a few meters away from me and looked at me in silence. I felt my legs give out, but I couldn't look away. "You shouldn't have come here," he said. His voice was low and hoarse, as if he hadn't spoken in a long time. "Who are you?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. It was the one who left the inscription on the tree. The one who stalked me. He didn't answer. Instead, he picked up the axe and walked towards me. I started running, not thinking about the direction. My legs carried me through the forest. I stumbled, fell, but got up and ran on. I could hear footsteps behind me, but I didn't look back. I knew that if I stopped, I would die. A few minutes later, I came across a road. It was an old primer, but for me it seemed like a salvation. I ran along it, hoping that someone would pass by. And then I heard the sound of an engine. It was a truck. I walked out into the middle of the road and started waving my arms. The driver stopped, and I saw that he was an elderly man with a beard. He looked tired, but kind. "What's wrong, kid?" he asked. "Help me," I gasped. "There, in the forest. He tried to kill me." The man frowned. "The forest? Are you talking about the Black Forest?" I nodded. "You're not the first one to escape," he said. "But you're the first survivor." He opened the door and motioned for me to sit down. I got in the cab and we drove off. I could feel the tension starting to subside, but then the man said, "Do you know who he is? The one in the forest?" I shook my head. "His name is Jacob Reynolds. He was a forester until he lost his mind. They say he killed his family and then hid in the woods. The police searched for him, but they never found him. He's like a ghost. He appears when he wants to, and disappears when he needs to." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Why is he doing this?" I asked. The man shrugged his shoulders. "Who knows? Maybe he just loves it. Or maybe he thinks that the forest is his home, and everyone who goes there is his guest." We reached the city, and the man dropped me off at the police station. I went inside and told him everything that had happened. They listened to me, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. Who would believe that a maniac lives in the forest? The police were skeptical of my story, but nevertheless agreed to check the forest. They sent a squad, but returned a few hours later with nothing. "No trace, no evidence," said one of the officers. "Maybe you just imagined it?" I knew it wasn't just my imagination. I saw him. I saw his sacrifice. But there was no proof. No tracks, no bodies. Only my words against the empty forest. I returned home, but I couldn't find peace. Every night I dreamed of the forest. I saw his eyes, cold and empty. I heard his voice, "You shouldn't have come here." I'd wake up in a cold sweat, and Sarah would ask what was wrong with me. I couldn't tell her. I didn't want her to be afraid. But after a few days, I realized that I couldn't just leave it. I couldn't live knowing that there was a man out there in the woods who was killing people and no one was trying to stop him. I decided to come back. Not alone, of course. I found 2 guys I used to work with. They were tough, strong, and I knew I could rely on them. I told them everything I had seen, and they agreed to help. We packed up our gear, flashlights, knives, and walkie-talkies in case we had to split up. We didn't intend to kill, but we didn't want to become victims either. When we arrived at the forest, it was already dark. The air was humid and cold, and the silence was so thick that I could hear my every step. We went inside, and I immediately felt fear squeeze my chest. But I couldn't show it. We walked slowly, lighting the way with lanterns. I led them to the clearing where I had seen the tool table. When we got there, the clearing was empty. The table was gone, and so were the tools. There were only footprints on the ground that someone had tried to erase. My friends looked at me suspiciously. "Are you sure you remember everything correctly?" Mike, one of them, asked. "I couldn't make it up," I replied. "He was here, and he knows we're here." We decided to split up. Mike and his brother, Tom, went one way, and I went the other. I knew it was stupid, but I wanted to find something that would prove my point. I walked slowly, lighting the way with a flashlight. A few minutes later, I heard a scream. It was Mike. His voice sounded like he was in agony. I ran towards the sound, but by the time I got there, it was too late. Mike was lying on the floor, his throat slit. Tom was standing over him, holding a knife in his hand. His eyes were blank, as if he didn't understand what was going on. What did you do?" I whispered. Tom looked at me, and I saw that his face was distorted with horror. He forced me," he said. "He said if I didn't do it, I'd die." Tom stood trembling, with a bloody knife in his hand. His eyes darted between me and the darkness of the forest, as if he expected him to appear from behind the trees any minute. The air thickened, the smell of blood mixed with the smell of rotten leaves. I stepped back, bumping into the trunk of a pine tree. "He's here," Tom whispered, and his voice broke into a hysterical laugh. "He's everywhere." Suddenly, the flashlight in my hand flickered and went out. The darkness swallowed us up. I heard Tom's breathing quicken, and his footsteps shuffled in my direction. He told me. "You're next," his voice sounded right in front of my face. I jerked to the side, tripping over the roots. My ears were ringing, and my heart was pounding as if it wanted to burst out of my chest. I heard footsteps behind me as Tom ran after me, growling like a hunted animal. Suddenly, the ground gave way under my feet, and I tumbled into a ravine. Hitting the rocks caused pain in his side, but the adrenaline drowned it out. Tom's silhouette froze at the top of the cliff. The flashlight in his hand was flashing, picking out a distorted face from the darkness. "Come out," he hummed as he swept the beam down the slope. "Playing hide and seek is boring." I pressed myself against the wet stones, trying not to move. His hand found something metallic, an old shovel with a broken edge. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted, and at that moment a ray of light slid over my leg. "I found it!" Tom jumped down, but I had already raised the shovel. The blow landed on his wrist, and the knife flew away with a clang. We fell to the ground, a mess of mud, blood, and leaves. His fingers dug into my throat, his eyes glittered with madness. "He's happy," hissed Tom. "You will." "A gift." I hit him with my forehead on the bridge of his nose with all my might. A crunch, a scream, the grip loosened. Breaking free, I grabbed a knife and ran without looking back. The voices followed me, either Tom or him, overlapping each other in an eerie chorus. "You're not leaving. You won't leave. You won't leave." The trees intertwined into a palisade, branches scratched his face. I suddenly realized where I was running, to the clearing with the hut. The moon came out from behind the clouds, illuminating the rotten roof. The door was open now, and inside, Tom was lying on the floor. The same Tom who was chasing me just now. His glassy eyes stared at nothing, and there was a blue garrote mark on his neck. But how? He was there. The crunch of a branch behind my back. I turned around. He was standing in the doorway. The hood fell off, revealing his face. Burnt skin fused with pieces of bark, as if the forest had grown into him. His axe hand slowly rose, pointing behind my back. I turned around. On the wall of the hut, words written in charcoal glowed in the moonlight. "All of you are mine." The axe whistled through the air. The forest closed around me like a giant living trap. The branches dug into his shoulders, grabbing at his skin with hooked knots. I lunged to the side, and something crunched in my shoulder, a dry arm of wood that broke off with a wet slurp. A warm liquid gushed out of a crack in the bark, smelling of copper and rot. He was following me. He didn't run, he swam, as if the roots had become his tentacles. The ground rose in waves under his steps, pushing bones to the surface in the tangles of the mycelium. A skull with a hollow in place of an eye socket rolled under his feet. His teeth snapped in the void. Oh, but I flew into a thicket where the trunks were so close that I had to turn sideways. The fog was thicker here. It clung to the skin with gelatinous threads. Something moved behind me, and when I turned around, I saw silhouettes slowly emerging from the fog. Mike with a gaping mouth, Tom with a crooked neck. Their feet did not touch the ground. "The game's not over yet," Mike rasped. His jaw dropped off, falling into the bracken with a thud. I ran, skinning myself against the bark. The air hummed, filled with the roar of cicadas. No, they weren't cicadas. It was the forest that was laughing. The mosses on the trunks pulsed, releasing spores that stung the eyes. Suddenly, the ground dropped out from under my feet. I fell into a pit studded with stakes. One of them stabbed into his side, piercing his flesh with cold fire. The earth fell from above. He stood on the edge, his fingers fused with the handle of the axe, becoming one with the weapon. His burnt face twisted into a smile as centipedes crawled out of the cracks on his cheeks, wriggling in time with his words. "Do you hear what they're calling?" The axe swung. I lunged to the side, and the blade bit into the log next to my head. The tree groaned, and black resin gushed from the wound. She burned her hand, sticking to the skin with living fibers. After getting out of the trap, I ran to the clearing where I had parked the car. His legs were buckling, and blood was oozing through his fingers, which were pressing the wound. The lantern had died an hour ago, but now I could see without light. The trunks glowed with pale decay, like bones in X-rays. The car. There she was, covered in cobwebs that pulsed like veins. I yanked open the door, and I was sitting inside, on the seat. The corpse with my face, crawling with maggots, turned its head and clapped its lips. "You stayed. Forever." The rear window cracked. His ivy-covered hand dug into my shoulder. The axe swung, and at the last moment I saw the real car 20 paces away, untouched. His left hand remained in his grip. I ran, bleeding, towards the iron silhouette. The keys. In my pocket. The door slammed shut just as the axe plunged into the roof. The engine roared. The road twisted like a snake, branches whipped against the windshield. In the rearview mirror, he was standing in the middle of the road, disappearing into smoke. But when I got on the track, the radio turned on by itself. A whisper broke through the static, becoming part of the engine's roar. "Did you think this was the end? We're in your blood. We're in your dreams. Come back when the bones start to sprout." At home, under anesthesia in the hospital, I had dreams. The roots are under the skin. The kidneys on the stump of his left arm. And his voice, coming from the depths of the wounds. "You're a tree now. You'll grow up. You will bloom. When the first green sprout came out of the stump a month later, I wasn't surprised. The pain stirred in the stump of his left arm as if it were alive. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, clutching a razor in trembling fingers. A green sprout from the scar throbbed as if worms were crawling under the skin. The doctor said gangrene, amputation, but I saw, from the window of the room on the 3rd floor, his figure in the far corner of the hospital garden. The hood, the axe, and the same hoarse whisper on the phone when the nurse left, "You're my seedling now." The blade pierced into the base of the sprout. Blood splattered on the sink, but something else flowed out with it, thick slime the color of forest mold. The mirror was fogged up, even though the water was closed. The condensation ran down in letters. "You can't cut off a family." A knock on the door startled me. Sarah's wife's voice sounded unnaturally high. "Dear." I opened the door. She was standing with a kitchen knife in her hands. Her eyes were glassy, like a porcelain doll's. "He said that if I brought your heart, he would bring our son back." Her hand trembled, the blade flashed. "Kid. Our boy. We buried him 3 years ago after the accident." "Sarah, he's dead." She rushed at me with a scream. The knife was aimed precisely at the sternum. "He's in the woods. He was in the forest all the time." We collapsed onto the tiles. Her nails dug into my face. The scent of her perfume mixed with the stench of rot from my stump. The razor fell out. Her hand reached for the towel on the hook, wrapped it around her neck, and tightened it. She wheezed, dropping the knife. Realization, horror, and pleading flashed in his eyes. I unclenched my hands. Sarah's body went limp. Black dots appeared on her neck, where the towel had left a red stripe. Disputes. They moved, forming the familiar words: come, garage, gasoline, a flamethrower bought after the forest. I drove, pressing the pedal to the floor, and reports of mass insanity were blaring on the radio. People within a radius of 50 kilometers from the Black Forest were cutting each other, whispering about a new family. The old entrance to the thicket now resembled a mass grave. Half-gnawed corpses hung from the branches, tied with vines like ribbons. The air was quivering with buzzing, not flies. Insects with human faces crawled under the collar, biting, leaving wounds in the shape of the letter J. He was waiting in the clearing. The axe stuck into a tree stump, on which lay a living carpet of hands. Dozens of hands, fused with fingers, stretched to the sky. "You're late." Jacob turned around. His skin now resembled bark. His eyes were knots with resin tears. "The roots are already in the cities." I pulled the trigger of the flamethrower. A stream of flames licked off his figure, but instead of screams, laughter rang out. A burning Jacob stepped through the fire, his hand digging into my throat. "You thought I was alone?" The forest around them began to move. The trees broke the roots, pulling them out of the ground like legs. The branches creaked as they folded into his arms. Hundreds of trunks with the faces of those who died here moved their jaws in unison. "We're away." The last thing I saw was the sky disappearing under the canopy of revived oaks. Jacob's voice seeped into my brain like a rhizome. "Soon your grandchildren will be watering you, sitting in the shade of your branches. You will be the cradle of a new family." When the fireman found the flamethrower, I already had 42 rings in me. The last memories were dissolving like smoke from burnt nerves. I could feel the bones cracking as they stretched out into the branches. Fingers broke with a crunch of twigs, nails turned into thorns. The skin was bursting, exposing the wood soaked in blood and tar. A film of moss covered my eyes. I could see through hundreds of peepholes on the bark, policemen with chainsaws, screaming people in protective suits, fire devouring the saplings. They hacked at me. The saw bit into the side, tearing out shreds of fibers. I wanted to scream, but instead of a sound, a swarm of gadflies with childish voices burst out of a crevice in the trunk. A masked policeman swung an axe, and the blow severed a branch, his former arm. Liquid gushed out of the wound, smelling of gasoline and Sarah's perfume. "Burn everything!" Someone was shouting. "The roots go under the city." Flames licked at the bark. I was burning, but I wasn't dying. I was getting bigger with each tongue of fire. My branches grabbed the fleeing ones, dragging them into the burning crown. A man in a hazmat suit got stuck in the fork of my roots. His screams stopped when the earth filled his mouth. Jacob was right. We are the forest. We are hunger. When the first child touched my burnt trunk, I felt the spores grow in his lungs. His mother was crying, clutching a small corpse to her chest, but within an hour her fingers had fused with the birch tree at my foot. We are growing. We're waiting.